Clearwater Bay Marine, Port Moody, British Columbia, a Thursday in late October just after 9. Serena Voss stepped out of a white Land Rover in a charcoal blazer and heeled boots that had no business being on gravel. Behind her came two men from her office, carrying rolled site plans under their arms. The yard smelled of salt and diesel and the cold coming off the inlet. Callum Marsh was on the roof of the dry dock office resealing the flashing around a vent stack. He had been up there since 7. He came down the ladder when he heard the car. He did not hurry. He had a caulking gun in one hand and a rag in the other, and he wiped his hands before he touched the ladder rails. Serena Voss looked at the yard the way someone looks at something they have already decided about. She looked at the old crane and the rack of salvaged propeller shafts along the south fence, and the two commercial hulls resting in cradles by the water. She looked at all of it the way people look at things they do not intend to understand. Callum reached the bottom of the ladder. She turned to him. She did not extend her hand. "You should sell this place before it sells itself, Mr. Marsh. We can make it clean and simple." She said it without cruelty, which was almost worse. Then she turned and walked back toward the Land Rover with her two men behind her, their boots sliding slightly on the gravel, and Callum watched them go from where he stood at the foot of the ladder with the caulking gun still in his hand. He went back up the ladder. He finished the vent stack. He moved along the ridge to the second seam and kept working. Like this video if you want to see how this ends. Drop your province or city in the comments. Stay until the final scene. You won't want to miss it. The yard emptied at 5. The two young riggers drove off in a shared pickup with a cracked taillight. The crane operator, a quiet man named Terrence who had worked the yard for 11 years, stayed an extra 20 minutes to run the daily log and locked the equipment shed on his way out. He nodded to Callum at the gate. Neither of them said much. They rarely did. Callum drove his truck northeast on the Barnet Highway toward Coquitlam. He got there 7 minutes before the end of the school day and parked along the curb with the engine running and the radio off. The leaves on the maples along the school fence had gone deep orange. There was still light in the sky, but barely. Juniper came out with her backpack, pulling her sideways, and a piece of paper folded into something that might have been a boat. She climbed into the cab and dropped the paper boat on the dash. "We made them in art. Ms. Fournier showed us how." "Does it float?" "It's paper, Dad. Paper floats." She considered this seriously. "We could try." He pulled out from the curb and into traffic. She unfolded and refolded the boat twice on the way home, improving something each time he couldn't quite see. "Daddy, what does derelict mean?" He looked at her briefly. She was watching the road. "Where did you hear that word?" "A lady said it. On the news this morning. She called something derelict. It means something that got left behind, not always on purpose." "That's sad." Sometimes. Sometimes things get left behind so they can become something else." She held the paper boat up to the window glass and looked at the light through it. They stopped at the yard on the way home so Callum could check the bilge pump on one of the holes in the cradle. Juniper walked along the fence line the way she always did, dragging a stick she found near the gate post, reading the yard like a map she'd memorized. She found a brass fitting in the gravel near the winch shed and held it up to the last of the light. Callum had already seen the business card on the office step when he pulled in. He picked it up on his way past without breaking stride and put it in the breast pocket of his jacket. Boss Development Group, Serena Voss, Chief Executive Officer. He did not read the rest. At home in Coquitlam, he heated the soup his neighbor Francis had left in a container on the back step that morning. Francis Ando was 73 and had known his mother and appeared regularly with food and no explanation, which Callum had long since stopped questioning. He left the porch light on for her on the night she came by, and she always came by. She arrived at 6:30 with a bag of apples and a sourdough loaf wrapped in a tea towel. "How was the day?" "It went." She set the apples in the bowl on the counter and looked at him. "Someone came to the yard. And she thinks I should sell." Francis pulled out a chair and sat down. She did not rush him. "People see what they want to see," she said. "They don't always look long enough to see what's actually there." Callum did not answer. He ladled soup into 3 bowls and called Juniper in from the living room. Juniper told Francis about the paper boats. Frances told her that paper boats only work once, which Juniper found philosophically interesting. After dinner, Juniper brushed her teeth and asked if the inlet water was cold enough for ice. Callum told her not yet. She fell asleep with the paper boat on the nightstand, still folded, still improving in her imagination. When he came back to the kitchen, Frances was already at the door. She tapped the doorframe on her way out. Old habit from the years she'd worked the cannery dispatch. Callum washed the dishes. He turned off the kitchen light and sat at the table in the dark for a while. He could hear the distant drone of a freight train on the CP line north of town. He could hear his daughter breathing in the next room. He set the business card on the table. He looked at it once. He turned it face down. He went to bed. Serena Voss was at her desk at Voss Development Group's Vancouver offices at 6:50 the next morning. The building was glass and cedar on the False Creek waterfront, her father's design, her renovation. She had been running the company for 4 years since her father retired to the Okanagan and stopped answering emails with any urgency. Her assistant brought the Port Moody site file at 7. She opened it and read the property assessment, the zoning history, the shoreline access designation. The yard sat on 2.4 acres of industrial waterfront on Burrard Inlet with deep water moorage access, the kind of frontage that did not come available twice. She had been told the owner would sell. The broker had said it in a way that suggested certainty. She had been to the yard in person because she believed in seeing things herself. She had seen a rusting crane, a weathered dock, a man coming down a ladder with a caulking gun. She had not stayed long enough to see much else. She called the broker at 8 and told him the conversation had not gone as expected and she would be filing the formal offer through the municipal shoreline review process instead. It was within her rights. It was the efficient path. She had taken the efficient path her whole career. What she did not do was stop thinking about the way the man had looked at her when she turned away. Not with anger. Not with pleading. With the particular stillness of a person who had absorbed worse than this and knew the difference. At 8:45, a silver RCMP staff vehicle pulled into the yard at Clearwater Bay Marine. Callum was loading chain onto the dock cart near the east slip. He looked up when the vehicle stopped. He did not move toward it. 2 people got out. The first was a man in a dark suit Callum didn't recognize. The second was Chief Superintendent Adele Fontaine of the Pacific Region Marine Investigation Unit, in service dress, 5 commendations on her lapel bar, and a posture that did not make accommodations for gravel. She crossed the yard without looking at anything but him. "Mr. Marsh, I apologize for coming without calling ahead." "Superintendent, you know who I am. I know your work." He set the chain down, then IMO. "The barge. I came to ask for your help." She looked at him directly. "The RCMP Marine Division is conducting a salvage assessment of 3 vessels seized in the Bennett Point operation last spring. 2 were in Esquimalt. 1 is here in Port Moody under a provincial hold. We need a civilian marine surveyor with deep salvage experience and a security clearance. Your name is the only one on the list that lives west of the Rockies and has both." Callum listened without moving. "I'm not doing survey work anymore. I know what you said 3 years ago. I'm asking anyway because what we have in the water requires the specific kind of judgment you spent 18 years developing." She did not pressure him further. She reached into her jacket and left a card on the chain rack beside him. Then she turned and walked back toward the vehicle. Her associate paused just before the door. He was younger, plain clothes, and he spoke quietly and without looking at Callum directly, the way someone speaks when they want the words to go sideways into the air rather than straight at a person. "There's a woman walking the perimeter of your property line at the municipal survey office right now. She's filed a shoreline access review. You have 30 days before it goes to committee." The door closed. The vehicle backed out of the yard. Serena Voss was in the lobby of the Port Moody Municipal Building at 10:15 when her assistant called to say that the Clearwater Bay Marine file had an active notation she had not been told about. She sat down on one of the bench seats by the window and opened the PDF on her phone. Clearwater Bay Marine held a federal Class A marine salvage operating license and a Transport Canada Tier 1 deep water clearance. There were, according to the notation, 11 licensed Class A marine salvage facilities in Canada. 3 were on the Pacific coast. The Clearwater Bay license was the oldest of the 3, and the only one with a restricted channel endorsement covering Bird Inlet. She read it twice. She thought about the man on the ladder, the way he had wiped his hands before coming down, the stillness. She called her father. He answered on the 3rd ring from what sounded like a dock somewhere. "Dad, what do you know about Clearwater Bay Marine in Port Moody?" A pause. "Then Callum Marsh's yard?" "You know it?" "I know him. Why are you asking?" Another pause, longer. "Serena." Her father's voice changed register in a way it only did when he was being careful with her. "What did you say to him?" She drove back to Port Moody that afternoon without filing anything at the municipal office. She had a folder in the passenger seat and nothing in her hands that felt right to carry. She found him at the south dock replacing a section of decking planks. He looked up when her car stopped. He went back to the planks. She walked across the gravel. "I came to say something I should have said before I filed anything. I'm withdrawing the shoreline access review." She stopped a few feet from the dock edge. "I told you to sell before I knew what I was looking at. I was wrong to say it. I'm sorry." He set the pry bar down on the dock. He did not look up immediately. When he did, he studied her the way people study the sky on a coast, not to find something wrong, but to understand what's actually there. "Okay," he said. That was all he said. She had prepared for argument or rejection, or the cold silence of a man who had decided. She had not prepared for a person who accepted an apology, the way someone accepts weather. She drove home. She did not call her broker. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop closed and looked out at the water for a long time. Superintendent Fontaine called her cell at 9 that evening. "Ms. Voss, I understand you're pursuing a development interest in the Clearwater Bay Marine parcel." I've withdrawn the filing." "I see." A pause. "Then I'll tell you what I was going to tell your broker, because I think you should hear it yourself. Callum Marsh spent 14 years as a marine salvage contractor with the Department of National Defense before he came back to Port Moody and took over his father's yard. In 2021, he conducted the post-seizure survey of the Strait of Georgia trafficking vessels, the one that led to the Bennett Point convictions. He did it under a federal confidentiality order. He has never spoken publicly about it." Serena said nothing. "He also lost his wife in 2021, Fontaine said, on the water." "I'm not going to say more than that. I wanted you to know who you were talking to before you made decisions about his yard." The call ended. Serena sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about the word derelict. She thought about what Callum had said, sometimes things get left behind so they can become something else. She had thought he was talking about salvage. She opened her laptop. She searched the Bennett Point operation. She found the press releases, the court records, the conviction summary. The survey report was referenced, but sealed. The surveyor's name was not listed. She closed the laptop. In the morning, she drove to a marine supply store on Commissioner Street in Vancouver and spent 15 minutes at the counter asking questions she didn't entirely know how to ask. She bought a tin of marine-grade teak oil, which the clerk said was a reasonable thing to bring to a working yard as a practical gift, not showy, not strange. She drove to Port Moody. Callum was checking the compression seals on the winch housing. He looked up. He looked at the tin in her hand. "My father told me your dock planking goes through a tin of this every winter." "He told you right. He also told me I owe you a conversation, not a business card. Not a filing." She set the tin on the dock rail. "He said you'd know what that means." Callum looked at the tin for a long moment. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He set it on the workbench and went to the office shelf and came back with 2 mugs of coffee and mismatched cups and held one out. They sat on the dock steps. The inlet was flat and gray and cold. A heron stood on the far piling without moving. Francis Ando came out of the equipment shed with a clipboard, saw Serena on the step, and stopped. She looked at Callum. He looked back at her. Francis nodded once, short and definitive, and went back into the shed. Juniper appeared from around the side of the office building with a horseshoe crab carapace she had found in the tide rack. She was holding it with both hands like a tray. She stopped in front of Serena and held it up for inspection. "Daddy says these are older than dinosaurs." "They are." "Are you the lady who was here before? With the boots?" "Yes." "You have different shoes today." "I do." Juniper examined her for a moment. "Daddy didn't say anything bad about you." She carried the carapace back around the corner of the office and set it carefully under the dock ramp where she apparently kept things. Serena looked at the inlet. She did not trust herself to say anything, so she drank her coffee instead. That evening, after Serena had driven back across the inlet and turned her phone to silent, a voicemail arrived from a number she didn't recognize. She listened to it standing at her kitchen counter in socks. A man named Graydon Falk, from a company called Falk Harbor Investments, spoke in a friendly, practiced voice about an exciting opportunity for waterfront activation along the Port Moody shoreline. He called it the Burrard Gateway Initiative. He said he would send the overview document. The document arrived at 11:15. She opened it at her counter with a glass of water in her hand and a bad feeling moving in her chest before she even scrolled to the map. The map showed 8 properties assembled along the east side of Burrard Inlet. 7 were marked in green. 1 was outlined in red. Clearwater Bay Marine, the full 2.4 acres, marked for rezoning to mixed-use residential. The anchor property of a development valued in the overview at $58 million. Without the yard, there was no deep water access. Without the deep water access, there were no waterfront units in the upper tier. She did not call anyone. She went to her office and opened 3 windows on her desktop and began working. By 2 in the morning, she had it laid out. 4 numbered companies registered to a single agent at an address in Abbotsford: Falk Harbor Investments, Pacific Rim Shoreline Group, Inlet Futures Development, and Coastal Renewal Properties Limited. They shared a registered agent. They had acquired 7 contiguous parcels in the last 22 months. The buying had accelerated in the past 6. All 4 filed their initial articles of incorporation through the same notary office on Kingsway. The notary had filed 168 numbered companies in 3 years. There was 1 parcel they had not yet acquired. She called the city archivist's office when it opened at 8 and asked for the full zoning petition history on the Clearwater Bay Marine Industrial designation going back 15 years. She asked for anything filed by any numbered company in the Port Moody jurisdiction over the same period. The archivist told her it would take until afternoon. She drove to the yard at noon. She did not bring coffee this time. She brought a printout of the company registry cross-reference and the petition history that the archivist had expedited. After she explained what she was looking for, she spread the pages on the hood of Callum's truck. He came around the side of the truck and stood beside her and looked. He did not seem surprised. He looked at the registered agent address. He looked at the numbered company names. He nodded slowly. "Falk has been trying to get this parcel since I refinanced in 2020. He couldn't find the angle until the shoreline access petition process opened up." "Why does he need your yard specifically?" Callum looked at the water for a moment. "Old story, not mine to tell twice." She did not push. Juniper came around the back of the office with a butter clam shell she was using as a scoop for the gravel. She walked up to Serena and held the shell out by the edge, offering it. Serena took it. She held it in her palm and did not know what to say, so she closed her fingers around it. Callum watched his daughter hand something to this woman for the 3rd time. He said nothing. He went back to looking at the map. That afternoon, Terrence came by the dock office and left a note on the bulletin board. The Port Moody Planning Committee had scheduled a rezoning consideration hearing for the Coastal Industrial District. 31 days from Thursday. Serena called her firm's legal counsel before she reached the highway. She called Superintendent Fontaine's office at 4. She called her father at 5 and talked for 20 minutes. He told her what he knew about Graydon Falk, which was more than she expected. The morning of the planning committee hearing, the council chamber at Port Moody City Hall was full past capacity. 2 reporters from the Tri-City News sat in the front row. A camera crew had set up near the side door. The chamber smelled of coffee and wet coats. Callum Morris came in a gray-collared shirt and dark slacks. No insignia. No certification pins. He sat in the second row next to Serena Voss, who had her hair down and was wearing the kind of jacket she wore when she meant to stay as long as it took. Graydon Falk spoke first as a private citizen, having filed a recusal from the vote 3 weeks earlier. He spoke about an aging industrial footprint out of step with the residential growth of the region. He spoke about remediation costs the city was absorbing. He spoke about a visionary opportunity for Port Moody families to live on the water. He said the word vitality 4 times. He did not look at Callum when he said the word aging. Serena Voss stood when he sat. She introduced herself as principal of Voss Development Group and the licensed Class B marine contractor operating in BC. She spoke to the microphone in a steady voice and she made 3 points. First, Clearwater Bay Marine held a federal Class A marine salvage operating license with a Burrard Inlet restricted channel endorsement. There were 11 such licenses in Canada, 3 on the Pacific coast. This was the only one with a restricted channel endorsement. That license was not transferable and could not be recreated on a different site. The property was not an aging asset. It was a federally designated operational infrastructure parcel. Second, she placed a 1-page registry diagram on the presenter table. Falk Harbor Investments had assembled 7 contiguous properties through 4 numbered companies sharing a single registered agent in Abbotsford. She named the companies. She named the agent. She noted that 3 of the company incorporations had been filed within 10 days of each other, 20 months prior, using language templated from the same document. She asked the committee to consider whether a rezoning petition so precisely timed and structured warranted an independent conflict of interest review before any vote. Third, she moved to postpone the vote pending that review. A murmur moved through the room. Graydon Falk adjusted his microphone. His voice was smooth. He had a good voice for rooms like this. Ms. Voss has an obvious personal interest in defending this property owner. Perhaps the committee would like to know why. The room waited. In the back, near the side door, Superintendent Adele Fontaine stood up. She had come in while Falk was speaking. She was in service dress. She did not move toward the microphone. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she let the room register who she was. The Tri-City reporter in the front row wrote 1 line in her notebook and underlined it. Callum Marsh stood up. He did not go to the microphone. He stood with his hands on the back of the bench in front of him, and he spoke from where he was. My wife was a search and rescue flight medic. She flew out of CFB Comox in all weather, and she was very good at it. She died in 2021 on a training approach in the Strait of Georgia. The investigation found an anomaly in the maintenance log of the aircraft. I had done contract survey work for the Department of National Defense, and I had the clearance to access the maintenance records of the subcontractor involved. I requested access. I produced a report. The report was classified. He stopped. The room was very still. The yard I run was my father's yard. He built it in 1987, and he worked it until his hands wouldn't let him anymore. It sits on the inlet he grew up beside. It holds a federal license that took 18 years to earn and cannot be replaced. I did not fight the classification of that report because my daughter was 3 years old, and she needed her father present and alive and not consumed. I am choosing differently tonight. He looked toward the front of the room, toward Falk. Mr. Falk, I don't know what you know about the subcontractor in that maintenance report, and I'm not prepared to say anything further here about the investigation. What I will say is that I've spent 4 years running that yard quietly so my daughter could have a childhood that isn't built on grief. This yard is what I have left to give her. She is 7 years old. She keeps a tide chart on her bedroom wall because her mother taught her to read the water before she could read words. The water should have brought her mother home. I am going to do everything I am allowed to do to make sure that yard stays standing for as long as my daughter wants to stand in it. His voice did not break. It dropped half a register in the last 2 sentences and came back up clean. The committee voted to postpone the rezoning consideration and to open a conflict of interest review into the numbered companies and their registered agent. The Tri-City News published the registry diagram 2 days later. By Monday morning, Falk Harbor Investments had withdrawn its development proposal in a statement that cited changed market conditions. Graydon Falk was not present at a scheduled city advisory meeting the following Thursday. No one said much about his absence in public. Several people said a great deal about it in private. The following Wednesday was gray and cold with a low ceiling off the inlet. Serena drove out at 7 and parked behind Callum's truck. She did not know exactly what she had come for. He was in the dock office at the coffee station, filling a dented enamel pot from the tap. He heard her car. He did not look up when she came through the door. He filled a second mug without being asked and held it out over his shoulder. She took it. They stood at the dock window. The inlet was flat, and the herons were on the pilings, and the light was the particular gray that Port Moody gets in November when the mountains disappear into the ceiling and everything on the water goes quiet. They did not speak for a while. Juniper came down the gravel path in her yellow raincoat with her hood up and her rubber boots on the wrong feet in the way that had stopped bothering anyone several months ago. Olive door opened with her shoulder and walked straight to Serena and opened her fist. A single feather, white and clean, the kind of gulls left on the dock after the low-pressure systems moved through. Mama called these sky letters, Juniper said. She said the birds carry them when someone needs to hear something. She held it up until Serena took it from her hand. The room was very quiet. Frances Ando sat in the corner with her clipboard across her knees. She watched Juniper. She watched Callum. She did not move. Callum looked at the floor. The angle of his shoulders shifted, the way a body shifts when something long held is allowed to settle. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the feather in Serena's hand. He looked at the water. It was the first time Juniper had said the word mama anywhere but in her sleep in 2 years. Serena put the feather inside the zip pocket of her fleece near her chest. She did not trust any other place for it. 3 weeks later, Callum's phone rang on a Sunday. The number was Fontaine's office, routed through a secure line. The superintendent's voice was direct and unhurried. "Mr. Marsh, I'm calling to offer you a civilian contract as a Marine survey consultant to the Pacific Region Marine Investigation Unit. You would not hold a rank. You would not deploy. You would advise on active file assessments as needed, and you would continue operating your yard without interruption." Callum listened. "I'm also calling to tell you something else. I was the senior officer who approved the classification designation on your 2021 report. I told myself the classification protected the operational review process. I know now that it also protected some decisions I had made that I did not want re-examined. That was wrong of me, and I am not asking you to work with my unit because I need your expertise. I'm asking because I owe you the opportunity to say yes or no on your own terms, with full information. That's what I can give you." Callum was quiet. "I'll think about it," he said. "Not for the unit, for Terrence. He's been telling me for 3 years that I stopped too soon." Frances was admitted to Eagle Ridge Hospital the following Monday. Her daughter called Callum at noon. The doctors said a few weeks, best case, and spoke in the careful way doctors speak when they have a number in mind and are not ready to say it out loud. Serena came to the hospital that evening. She brought soup from the Korean place on St. John Street that Frances had told her about once while they were standing in the yard drinking coffee in the rain. Frances took 3 spoonfuls and said it was correct, which was her highest culinary endorsement. She told Serena, in a thin voice, that her mother had been a fish plant supervisor on the same section of waterfront in 1962. And that the world tends to send the same people back to the same places across different generations if you pay attention to it. She said this without sentimentality, as a logistical observation. Callum sat across the bed and said nothing. He watched Serena sit. He watched his daughter's keeper of Tuesdays accept 3 spoonfuls of soup and deliver a verdict on them. Something in his chest settled a further notch. Callum signed the civilian contract with the Pacific Region Marine Investigation Unit on the 15th of December. He kept the yard. He drove to the regional office in New Westminster 2 mornings a week. The rest of the week he was in coveralls. Clearwater Bay Marine and Voss Development Group signed a Marine Infrastructure Partnership Agreement on the same day. The agreement was 26 pages plus a rider that Serena had written in pencil first, then typed twice before she was satisfied with it. The Juniper Rose Callahan Educational Trust, 4% of net annual contract revenue in perpetuity, split between a dedicated educational savings account for Juniper Marsh and annual bursaries for 5 children of BC search and rescue personnel. The trust was registered under Juniper's full middle name, Rose, which had been her mother's name and had not appeared on any legal document in 3 years. Callum read the writer. He set the pen down. He sat with his hands flat on the table for a long moment. Catherine would have written this herself, he said. She would have put in a clause about pelicans. Serena did not ask what he meant. She thought she understood. He signed. Frances died at Eagle Ridge on a Sunday in January in the early morning, the way the tide goes at low ebb. Without announcement, having already decided, the memorial was held at the Port Moody Legion, which she had attended every Remembrance Day for 40 years, and which smelled of old wood and floor wax. The room was full. Terence came. Fontaine sent a letter. Callum read it alone in the yard the next morning and did not show it to anyone. Hugh Voss drove in from Kelowna for the service. He stood in the back of the hall beside his daughter. After the reception, in the parking lot, he walked over to Callum and held out his hand. They shook for a long moment. Mr. Marsh, Mr. Voss. That was enough. The spring that followed was wet and bright and cold in the mornings. The yard expanded its dock capacity under the new federal contract and hired 2 additional certified riggers in March. Terence ran the new crew orientation with the thoroughness of a man who had been waiting to do it for years. Serena's firm took on the structural assessment for a historic marine salvage building in New Westminster, which led to a second project in Victoria, which led to a third conversation about the coast and what it needed. On a Saturday in April, with the inlet going silver in the late afternoon and the dogwoods in the upland lots coming into white flower, Callum took Juniper down to the end of the dock to continue the bowline lesson. He had been teaching it in stages, 1 step at a time, since November. Rabbit out of the hole, around the tree, back down. She tied it wrong on the first try. He showed her again without comment. She tied it right on the second try. She held it up with both hands and her face was the kind of proud that has nothing to perform. There you go. He untied it and handed it back. She tied it a third time, faster, and held it out for his inspection. He took it, turned it, handed it back. She tied a fourth, cleaner still. He looked up and saw Serena at the dock edge. He did not say anything. He held out his hand. She walked over. The 3 of them went out to the end of the dock. The tide was low and the mud banks were exposed, and the herons were working the shallows in their unhurried way. Juniper ran ahead to look for clams. The inlet made the small sound it makes when it has nowhere pressing to be. Callum stood beside Serena. He looked at the water. You once told me to sell this place before it sold itself. I did. And then you came back. She did not answer right away. She looked at the heron on the far piling, standing very still in the way herons stand when they are not hunting, when they are simply being present at the water. I came back because I looked long enough. He let that sit. It was the kind of answer that had room in it for everything that had happened and everything that hadn't yet. After a while, without looking at her, he reached out and touched the back of her hand with the back of his. Just that. A small and careful thing. Down at the mudline, Juniper held up a clam shell the size of her forearm and shouted something into the wind that neither of them caught. It didn't matter. They knew the tone. They knew what it meant. In the regional office at New Westminster that same afternoon, a file clerk delivered a sealed envelope to Superintendent Fontaine's desk. No return address. Inside was a photograph printed on plain paper. 3 people at the end of a wooden dock at low tide. A man in a work jacket. A woman in a gray fleece. A small girl in a yellow raincoat with her boots on the wrong feet, holding something large and pale up toward the sky. Fontaine looked at the photograph for a long time. She set it on the corner of her desk beside the unit citation from the Bennett Point operation. She stepped back. She looked at the 2 things together. She did not say anything. She bowed her head once, briefly. Then she went back to work. He had kept the yard. She had come back to it, and in the space between those 2 facts, without anyone declaring it, something the inlet had been waiting on had finally come to rest. I keep thinking about the moment Serena walked back into that yard a second time. Not with a filing, not with a folder. With a tin of teak oil and something sitting in her chest that hadn't been there the first visit. She didn't have to go back. She had every professional reason to file the access review and move on to the next parcel. But she'd looked long enough, finally, and what she saw changed the calculation entirely. That's the thing about Callum. He never argued for himself. He went back up the ladder. He finished the vent stack. He wiped his hands on a rag and let the moment pass without making it smaller by fighting it in the wrong place at the wrong time. A lot of people would call that restraint. I think it's something closer to a kind of integrity that doesn't need a witness to function. He knew what the yard was. He knew what the license meant. He knew what he had earned across 18 years of work in conditions most people never see. None of that changed because someone in the charcoal blazer decided she already understood the situation. There's a cause and effect running through this whole story that's easy to miss if you're watching for the dramatic moments. Callum chose, years earlier, to produce a report he knew would cost him something. He chose to classify it quietly rather than make his grief into a campaign. He chose to keep showing up at the yard every morning in coveralls, while the world around him reorganized itself. Each of those choices built the next one: the federal license, the 18-year track record, the reputation that put his name on the only list that mattered when Fontaine needed someone she could trust. None of that appeared by accident. It accumulated, quietly, over years of doing the work correctly, even when no one was watching and no one was going to reward him for it. Serena's arc is the one I find myself sitting with. She's smart. She built something real. But she walked into that yard and made a judgment in under 5 minutes based on what a crane looked like and what gravel felt like under her boots. And then she had the character to go back, withdraw the filing, and say so out loud to his face. That second walk across that gravel cost her something. Pride, maybe. Certainty. The comfortable feeling of having already decided. I think what she found on the other side of that discomfort was worth more than the $58 million development map she'd been carrying in her passenger seat. Juniper handing Serena things: the carapace, the clamshell, the feather, 3 times across the story. A 7-year-old with no agenda, no strategy, just an open hand. Kids that age don't extend trust strategically. They extend it because something in the room feels right to them. I don't think Callum missed that. I think he watched it and said nothing because some things only mean what they mean if you let them develop at their own pace. What stays with me is that none of the 3 qualities that carried these people through: the willingness to do right by others, even when it cost you, the discipline to understand a situation before you act on it, and the steadiness to keep going when the weight of it is considerable. None of them announced themselves. They showed up in small actions: a rag wiped before coming down a ladder, a filing withdrawn, a contract kept in a safe when you were told to burn it. The yard is still standing. That's not luck. That's the sum of a lot of quiet choices made correctly over a long time.